Welcome to Solosaurus, a podcast about one-player board and card games. My name is Brandon Waite.
And my name's Carter Mackey.
And this is episode 39, where we're going to be talking about a game about fighting in the world's most commercially successful irradiated hellscape, Fallout: Wasteland Warfare. Have you played many Fallout games?
I've tried to play 3 and 4. Didn't really get into them. I probably dumped, 10 to 15 hours in each.
All right, I dumped a lot of hours into number 3.
Right.
And never played New Vegas, which is apparently the one to play.
Right, yeah.
And a little bit of 4. And really found the worlds compelling and interesting. And apparently a lot of people do. And we've had a lot of requests for this particular game. So if you're interested in playing a miniatures game set in a post-apocalyptic landscape with 40s music and some, fast-talking high pants sort of movie tropes,
yeah,
this is for you. But before we get to that, we will start like we always do with the news. And we have just a couple of bits of news to talk about this week, but both of them are pretty big, I would say. So the first one is Taburu from CMON Games. This was announced at Gen Con, and Taburu is basically a platform for playing games. So it's a board that has sensors in it and dice with sensors and bases that go on miniatures that have sensors, and you can play a game on top of this pad that sits on your table, and it communicates your movements and your rolls and everything to a tablet or a laptop. So we've not seen any video of this being used because I don't think anybody was allowed to shoot video of actual gameplay. But based on the promotional video that CMON has put out, this looks like it would take out a lot of the upkeep for a solo player or really any game group.
Right.
And what's most interesting is they're showing this as coming to Kickstarter in 2020 and that it will be packaged with Zombicide Evolution, which looks like it's just a sensor-heavy version of Zombicide. But they intend to use it with other CMON games. It looks like they showed Death May Die in the video. But they also want to invite other publishers to put their games on here. So, I don't know. I feel like this has some promise. It could be an interesting platform.
It'll be interesting to see, especially with just actually having actual footage of seeing people play it, getting more impressions. Because, like you said, it was behind closed doors. And I think the response was really good. But still, I'm sure everything was highly curated and controlled and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. And it's one thing to get this going with their own games, right? It's another thing to sell it as a platform for other publishers.
Right.
So if they could get this off the ground and get other people to invest in it, that would be a huge move for the board game industry.
Right. I have a hard time seeing anything other than smaller publishers hopping in on it. I can't see any of the big ones really sharing in that.
Yeah, that's true. I'm guessing that Asmodee wouldn't want to prop up CMON, right?
No.
They wouldn't want to boost their sales because CMON's doing just fine.
Yeah.
So if anybody could pull this off, it would be CMON or, Asmodee. So I'm interested to see where this goes. When we have more information on this, we'll probably cover this on news segments in the future. But for now, since that's all we've got to go on, that's all we have to say. This is Taburu from CMON Games. I almost said CMON. Got to change that habit.
Yeah.
Our second bit of news is a big announcement from Stonemaier Games, and this is for a game called Tapestry. This is a 1 to 5 player civilization game that's supposed to play in 90 to 120 minutes, which is that sweet spot that people have been aiming for a long time, and nobody's quite captured.
For a civilization game?
Yeah. Yeah, Civilization and 4X games in particular seem to shoot for this time frame, and nobody's really nailed it yet.
What was Nation's goal?
Nation's, I think, played in maybe 2.5 hours, something like that. It was pretty close.
Yeah.
It was trying to be that kind of stripped down experience from Through the Ages or something. It's very clearly influenced by Through the Ages. But from my perspective, it doesn't quite capture it.
No, it doesn't.
So maybe Stonemaier Games will be able to. This does have a solo mode in the box from the Automa Factory, so it's going to be a well-considered solo mode. It looks interesting. Comes with big chunky town pieces that are pre-painted in the box. And you can pre-order this one in September. It looks like they've already produced it. It's already on the way here. And they're just going to open the pre-orders for it. And if Wingspan is in any indication at all, if you're interested in this, you might want to get in on the pre-order. Because Wingspan sold out almost immediately and then wasn't available for quite a while. So if this is something that looks like it might be up your alley, there's a little bit more information on Stonemaier Games' website. Make sure you get in on that pre-order starting in September. That's all the news that we've got for you this week. So we are just going to jump into our review because it's a bigger one this time. And it's a review for Fallout Wasteland Warfare, which to start is not Fallout the board game from Fantasy Flight Games. These came out around the same time, but there was like a Deep Impact Armageddon situation.
Right, yeah.
So this is not a board game. It is a tabletop miniatures game, which makes this a little bit different for us. This comes to us from James Sheehan. He's the designer on this one. And the publisher is Modifius Games, which typically does tabletop RPGs. Came out in 2018 and plays 1 to 8 players if you have more terrain and everything. This is a 2-player starter set that we're going to be reviewing today. So Fallout Wasteland Warfare is a tabletop miniatures game, so not a traditional board game, that puts players in the Fallout universe. It includes this entire narrative campaign arc set in that world, as well as different unique random missions with narrative style objectives. You can recover caps, which are the currency in this world, to upgrade your crew's perks and weapons and gear, and give you different upgrades for your next encounter. And so in either player versus player or tournament mode, players try to survive in the tabletop wasteland. So for our purposes, what's most interesting is that this is a game that comes with a robust card-driven solo mode that has received a lot of praise and attention. And in fact, it's listed as best with 1 player on Board Game Geek.
Okay.
Yeah, this one has really gained some traction in the solo community. And so that's why we wanted to take a look at it. Full disclosure, we're not tabletop miniatures people.
Not at all.
Yeah, I played the X-Wing miniatures game for like 5 minutes when it came out. I had a copy, bought a few extra ships, but just most people weren't interested in playing. And there's a little bit of upfront work that has to be done with building your fleet or whatever. And I just couldn't find a steady group to play with. And I've never been part of tournament scenes, period. So yeah, I thought it was interesting, did some really cool things. But when I realized that some of my favorite parts of X-Wing, like how they handle damage for your ships, they used in other games. I mean, that's basically how Wounds and Mansions of Madness and Eldritch Horror and that sort of thing. That was when I decided to leave. That was my favorite part of the game. So yeah. I'm just starting to explore miniatures games a little bit right now, but nothing quite like this. And even if we were familiar with tabletop miniatures, this is still a little bit of a weird case because usually these games are 1v1 or team games or something like that.
Right, yeah.
They almost never have a solo mode, and it's hard to imagine how one would work because the nature of tabletop miniatures games is that you have this totally free range kind of movement, and that's hard to handle with an AI,
right,
typically. So supposedly they've managed to do it, and that's why we're going to talk about it on this show. And we're just going to start by talking about the components for this 2-player starter set. And I have some mixed feelings about this.
What are those mixed feelings?
Well, the miniatures are pretty good.
They're not mind-shattering, but they're good.
Yeah, they're good. They come on these specialized bases that have kind of terrain built into the base, which is nice because that's not a given. Actually, it's pretty unusual for most miniatures in board games or in tabletop games, period. Typically glue your miniature onto a plain base or whatever. These have little sticks and rocks and things like that. They're good quality miniatures. They're not hard plastic, come on a sprue quality miniatures.
Right.
They're not Games Workshop miniatures. That is still the top tier as far as I'm concerned. They're the best looking. They get these really dynamic and interesting poses because you have to glue them together. You know, these do come pre-assembled, and they come in this colored plastic that allows you to differentiate the different units on the board, which is kind of nice. Now, I do have to say, we've not had any experience with just the plain miniatures. The reason that we have a copy of this game to review is because one of our listeners, Ben Waxman, has a painting commission kind of business on the side called Miniatures Mutated. And he reached out to us and asked if we'd like to review a copy that he had pre-painted. And so we got this copy that's all the miniatures are pre-painted, which is super nice to be able to open up one of these games and not have to do that prep work.
Right.
or just play with a bunch of amorphous plastic. So a little plug here at the start of the show. If you're interested in painting commissions, you should definitely check out Miniatures Mutated on Facebook. They weren't involved with the design of the game or anything like that, so it's not going to affect our review. But we are going to give this game away at the end of this. So stick around to figure out how you can enter to win a copy, a pre-painted copy of this game. But just full disclosure, that's how we've experienced it as a painted game. And it does look nice on the table with the painted miniatures.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, though, what's in this game is you've got the 12 miniatures with the bases, and then you've got some rulers, basically some like template rulers for movement, a couple of rule books, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a few minutes, and you have tokens and cards, and some nice dice.
And also the battle mat.
Oh, yeah, the battle. Well, mat seems generous, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a piece of paper, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 2 pieces of paper. Yeah, you don't have to play on your just bare tabletop, which is nice. But playing on folded up pieces of paper that look like a wasteland, that have nice art even. I'll say that, artistically they look great. But the folds don't go away, and it never stops feeling like you're playing on paper.
Right.
They do offer, of course, neoprene mats and that sort of thing that you can buy.
I mean, I feel like if you're into miniatures, you're used to that, though.
Yeah, that's one thing we should say up front, too, is if you come at this game and you see the price of it, which is considerably higher than a typical board gamer would probably expect of this, you're going to think this is a ripoff, right? This is not very much in the box for this amount of money. This is just the way that miniatures games work. You get a core set. It costs a lot of money. You don't get that many miniatures for that amount of money. But usually the miniatures are higher quality, and what you're paying for is the base system, including the rules. In a Warhammer player's mind, the rules are a thing that are worth paying for, and usually worth paying like $40 for. So it's a whole different mindset.
Right.
That you just have to start to get your head around if this is something that you're interested in. So it's going to look like there's not much in the box, but there is, everything you need to play. And one thing I will say that I do really like about this are the dice.
Yes.
They're not typical D6s.
No, they're D12s, which are the most underused dice ever.
Oh, man. D12s feel so good to use.
Yeah.
And custom D12s, too.
Yeah.
Not just like numbers or whatever. They've got different icons on them, and they're different colors. And one of the things I like about this game is, for the attack system, which we'll get into in a little bit, you have the chance to roll multiples of these dice at one time. And it feels really good.
Yeah. Big, chunky D12s.
Yeah, man. I love that. So the dice in here are really solid. The tokens, though. Okay, I don't mind tokens. I like cardboard tokens just fine. But there's a generally agreed upon size for tokens. It's nickel-ish, nickel to quarter, right?
Yeah.
These are teeny tiny.
Yeah, they're so small.
They're so small, and you didn't punch these out. But when I was punching these things out, I know this sounds like nitpicking, and that's what we do here, right? We nitpick for you because we love you. It took me ages to punch these out because you try to punch them out and they hang every time because they're so small. And then what ends up happening is you start tearing the paper on the outside of them. So a couple of the tokens are all kind of janky and torn up because I couldn't figure out how to just punch them out cleanly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the tokens are a little bit bigger than a pencil eraser, like the end of a pencil.
Yeah, that's about the size we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So it's just hard. You can't poke your finger through that hole to punch these things out.
No.
So it's a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but you definitely need some kind of Plano box or something for this because there's a million of these little tokens and they need to be separated and everything to be useful. Right now, I've just got them dumped into bags. That's how I gave them to Carter.
Yeah.
Which he loved.
Right. That was my favorite.
Yeah, mine too.
Right.
But if you put a little time into organizing it, it's useful. But it's just, the game looks fiddly as soon as you open the box because it has just a ton of little tokens to keep track of everything.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically what I thought when I opened it up. I was just like, wow, there's a lot of little things in here.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're annoying and you drop them on the floor or whatever, but it's not the end of the world. It's just, since we're trying to cover the game thoroughly, we're just going to mention that stuff to you. It's probably not a big deal to 80% of people out there. Overall, I would say the components are solid.
Yes.
The miniatures look nice when they're painted up. I wish that we had more than paper to play on. I also wish, and we were just talking about this before we started recording, but I wish there was some kind of terrain in here.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of those things that, like, not being into like wargaming or any of that kind of tabletop miniatures thing, I don't have any terrain. I have no interest in getting that. That's not something that gets me like excited as far as like, getting into that and kind of building a collection. And so, yeah, it doesn't have anything to kind of use. And maybe for a starter set, maybe that's just me assuming too much on what is expected in a starter set. But based on how some of the rules start off as far as explaining to people new to miniatures combat, it's still a little strange to me. We can go into that more later. But yeah, I don't know. It would have been nice to have something.
Yeah, I agree. And again, my only frame of reference for this is Games Workshop a little bit and X-Wing. And Games Workshop's just a whole nother kind of price tier. So thinking about X-Wing miniatures game from Fantasy Flight, when you bought the core set, you got a handful of pre-painted ships, and the cost was much lower to get in. It was like $30 for the core set, which was, I think, a smarter idea. Just lower barrier to entry to see if you even like the game first. Mm-hmm. A lot more people were just willing to give it a chance. And then inside the box, you get, the cards and tokens and dice you need. And then you also get just a few pieces of punch-out cardboard asteroids or whatever that you fly around. And that seems like a small thing, but, miniatures games are about movement. If you've not played a tabletop miniatures game before, you would think that it's about rushing up and attacking your opponent, but it's really not. Typically in these games, attacking is pretty boring roll to resolve for the most part. It's the movement that's actually the game. Positioning yourself in such a way that you have cover and your opponents don't, and that sort of thing. And when there's no cover in the box, you take away a huge piece of what makes a tabletop miniatures game what it is.
Right. Yeah, I just ended up cutting up some like paper just to implement something.
Yeah. Well, I think you would have to do that, or just buy one of their reasonably priced packs of extra material on their website. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what they really want you to do.
Right.
Pay $30 for a couple of pieces of plastic that look like sandbags and bullet casings or something.
Yeah, sure.
And to be fair, I do have interest in terrain. I love 3D terrain. I think it looks awesome. And I don't even really have a use for it, but I just want it. And I want to paint it, and I want to keep it.
Yeah.
I want to make little Christmas villages out of it. But yeah, I wish that it came with a little bit of that. Overall, though, the components are fine. When we get into the rules, this is where we have to think a little bit differently than a typical board game purchaser or board game player would. Because, when you buy a board game, you look at the rule set as something that very obviously is going to come in the box, right? And it's going to be accessible, and sometimes they're not as accessible as they should be. Right. But it's just part of getting a game. For miniatures games, a lot of times people buy the rule book separately, and that's a huge part of what you're paying for. I am happy to say there's a robust rule set in this game. In fact, when you open up the box, you're going to get 3 rule books. Going to get a Learn to Play guide, a full Rules of Play guide, which is bound like a soft cover book, and then you're going to get a campaign guide. And I really like the system for how they've laid out these books for the most part, because if you open up the box and you see the full Rules of Play, it is daunting.
It is a lot.
It's like 70 pages or something. I don't remember how many exactly, but it's a bigger book. And that's pretty standard for these games. But what's nice is that in the box, there's this 6-page Learn to Play guide. Really simple. Walks you through a few of the basic rules, and then sets up this series of very simple tutorials that assume that you have never played a miniatures game before, which is great.
Yes.
Because movement, especially, is just totally foreign for somebody who's not played this kind of game before.
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. I mean, I would say even for a lot of people, if you haven't played them, I mean, they're pretty basic things, but it's nice that it includes it in there, assuming that you've never had any experience with these style of games before.
Yeah, I do think they're so simplistic in a couple of cases, they could have just been videos.
Could have been videos, or there just could have been a little bit, I feel like, more to it as far as getting into like slightly more advanced aspects of it, or just kind of teaching more of the mechanics of the actual game and these things would have been nice.
Yeah, I feel like it was a good effort.
Yeah.
Especially the movement one was clever because they have you take some of the rulers that come in the game that you use for movement and create like a fence in the middle of the board. And you have to walk around this fence because it's a toxic pool.
Right.
It teaches you about how you can't really cut corners exactly. And that's helpful because if you've only ever played board games, you're just used to a grid, essentially, that you're moving along. That's good for a board game setting, but if you want to play a robust miniatures game, you need total freedom of movement. And it just takes a little getting used to. I feel like that was good. They ease you into combat really well. Overall, really happy with that. Beyond that, though, it's just a lot of rules.
It is a lot of rules, a lot of things to keep up with for each character. It's not even necessarily a diversity of different types of characters you're having to control, but the different characters you have, the special modifiers they have, all the things you have to keep up with modifying your dice, how many dice you're supposed to roll. It can be a lot to take in and a lot to easily mess up in one way or the other.
Yeah, for sure. I found myself constantly looking through the rule book to be reminded of things. And, some of that's to be expected. And also because this is not the kind of game I typically play. So maybe if you are a tabletop miniatures person, maybe this makes more sense to you. Mm-hmm. But this felt like a very icon heavy game for one thing. And it took me a while to work my way through all of that. And I felt like I would make a move and think, I feel like there was something else I was supposed to do here. I just had this constant nagging feeling like I was forgetting something. And we've talked about that with other games before. I had that same experience with Feudum. I don't think the rules are laid out poorly here. It's just that there's so many of them that I never actually feel immersed.
Yeah, very much always thinking of that, I guess, of all those things and double checking. And I feel like it's one of those things that it would take me a while before I memorized them all, because to me it felt like just complete memorization of all these little things and just keeping up with all there's a lot to consider and to take in, at least for me.
I guess the flip side of that is that this isn't a game about just running over and hitting your enemy and rolling some dice and being done, right? There's way more to consider as part of that than you might imagine if you're just looking at this game as an outsider. And so if you want a rule set that is meaty and that you can really sink yourself in and learn the nuances of over a long period of time, this feels to me like a lifestyle game in some ways.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because one thing that's really nice about this rule set is there's not just rules for combat against another player, but there's combat against an AI system. That is a well-considered, well-thought-out system. That does add quite a few rules.
Yes.
Right, but that does mean you've got something to chew on and explore for a while to come. You can build settlements and flesh those out over the course of multiple games and add new buildings and bring new people in, and all the things that they introduced in Fallout 4, basically, with that entire system are here. Plus, there's a crew that you can build up over multiple games and take them through a campaign system that's included in the box. Plus, there are, in addition to that, more scenarios that you can download online. It seems when you open the box like there's not that much game in here. But in some ways, there's quite a bit.
Right.
Because the rules are heavy, but in those rules, they just create space for so many possibilities. If you want this game to be a sort of one-off scenario-based game where you play against one of your friends, it can be that. If you want it to be a weeks-long campaign that you sit down and immerse yourself in, it can be that too.
There's definitely a lot to the game as far as like what it could be. And some of that is in the box, but a lot of that could just be expanded upon because the rule sets are deep enough to allow something like that.
Yeah, I think that's true. Overall, I'm impressed with what they've managed to accomplish here on a theoretical level. But just practically speaking, it's a lot to keep in your head. For me, I do tend to gravitate more toward games that have low burden rule sets that have just a lot of play space.
Right. Yeah. Just thinking more about, I guess, more of the concepts of the game than keeping up with all the rules and making sure you're executing all these like kind of technical advantages you could possibly exploit to gain.
Yes.
The, I guess, advantage or upper hand.
But there is a kind of player out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
That this is made for, I would say.
Yes.
And even though, just to be totally upfront with you, this is not my kind of game naturally, I do still think that there are some systems in here that are really interesting. And if you're interested in exploring a solo miniatures game, there are some things in here that are very cool. You should at least consider if you're looking at buying this game or trying it out. And so that's where we move just a little bit more into the play of this game. And we'll start, I think, by talking about movement, because the way these games work generally is you're going to field a number of characters on the board. Characters generally have values assigned to them based on how powerful they are or how many perks they have, and you have a limit of points that you can put on the board. That's miniatures games. Generally, that's how they work. You play 1,000-point game or whatever, and you get 1,000 points worth of stuff. It's not all that different from building a deck for a trading card game or a CCG or something like that. But beyond that building of the crew or units that you have, the key component for these games is how you move. And there are a couple of kind of main classes of miniature game movement. So one is just it's a ruler kind of game where you have an actual ruler or a tape measure, and you have a character that can move 5 inches on their turn. And you get out your ruler and measure that amount of space. And what's nice about that is that gives you the freedom to move how you want to move. You know, if you want to, for instance, the new Games Workshop game, Warcry, skirmish-based game, I noticed the other day has this bendy ruler for sale so that if your character can move 5 inches, you can go 2 inches and bend it to go around a corner and then do another 3 inches. So it's just total freedom to move wherever you want to go. On the other side of that is the X-Wing miniatures game, which a lot of people out there might have tried at some point because it's hugely popular, where you can only move according to a template. So there are these like cardboard sticks, essentially, that you put out in front of your ship. You put one of them at the front end of your ship, you pick it up, and you move it to the other end of the cardboard stick. And that includes how you turn. You know, so if you want to make a turn, you've got a little cardboard curve token that tells you this is what a 1-speed turn looks like. That's very restrictive. It's easier for new players to get their head around because people don't tend to think in terms of inches, you know, for board games or whatever. And if you're a board game player, it just feels so much easier to transition to templates than to change over to a game of inches, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So I think this game is somewhere in between, because you get these big cardboard templates that are color-coded, and you see on your little character's card, okay, you have yellow movement. You pick out the yellow ruler, you put it in front of your figure, you pick up your figure, and you move it to the end of the ruler. And that's how far you can move. It's a pretty simple, straightforward system. There is no, like, curving or anything. There's no curved templates in the box. So you don't have to worry about only being able to turn a certain number of degrees or whatever. But it's also not as completely free as a typical ruler system, I would guess.
I think you can still use it to curve, though, from what I understand.
Yeah, you can.
Right.
I guess it's just you don't... There's something a little bit comforting in seeing a color-coded template that is like, this is my number of move.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very easy. It reads very well between the colors and kind of getting an idea of just what the range is and things like that.
Yeah. And that range that's how not only movement is handled, but also all of like range finding in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, there are generally 2 types of attacks that you'll do in this game. You'll have ranged attack or melee. If you're going to melee somebody, you can just use your normal number of move and walk up to them and hit them. Or you've got a special color code at the top of your card that says, hey, here's your charge value. So you can move yellow distance normally, or you can move orange distance, which is a little bit farther, and run up to somebody and bash them, which is thematically pretty cool, I think. And you'll get a bonus for running up to them and charging them with your wrench or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you get to roll extra dice that give you more bonuses and that sort of thing. I don't know. I feel like that all works together really well. And the way that cover works in this game is pretty easily handled as well. Where if you are behind a piece of terrain, if you're trying to scale some difficult terrain, your movement ruler is reduced by 1 size to get to them. So, I mean, it's pretty easily handled, I would say. It accounts for different kinds of terrain in ways that make you think, ways that make me think. I wish there was terrain in the box.
Yes.
But that part isn't crazy complicated, at least at the base level.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it just is very simple and works well. It's one of the better, more simplified, I guess, aspects compared to just normal miniatures games.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't have that much experience to draw on, but that's just
right. I mean, that's me assuming.
Yeah, that my assumption is it's a pretty simple system, and movement being one of the most important systems that matters. What's a little bit more complicated beyond that is how you handle skill checks. There's so much more than we could cover on this show, but just kind of the basic idea here is you've got a card in front of you with your unit picture on it, and you've got a handful of stats. Strength, perception, endurance, intelligence, agility, and luck, which are the normal Fallout stats, the special stats. That's the acronym that they form, right? And it's cool to see all those listed here. That's thematically appropriate. Also, what's interesting is each of these stats is assigned an icon or two that tell you, hey, if you're going to do a melee attack, you've got a knife symbol there. That's usually associated with strength. So if you're going to try to hit somebody up close and personal, you need to roll this strength check. And that means rolling this 20-sided die. 20-sided die. And what you want to do is you want to roll lower on that die than the value of your stat. And that's how you determine if you were successful or not. And here's where we start to get into my problems with miniatures games, generally speaking. Roll to resolve, still not interesting. No, it's really not. Now, I will say that this is typically where a lot of miniatures games should stop. They don't put hardly any effort into handling attacks. So a lot of Warhammer stuff, for instance, is just compare my strength with your toughness, and you need to roll the right amount. And if you don't roll the right amount, you just don't do anything, know. And there's still a lot of that here.
Yes.
You play through the tutorial missions, and you can, at one point, you're supposed to be shooting cans off these little ledges. You can just stand there and shoot and shoot and shoot and just keep rolling the wrong number, and you feel like a real noob in this world. I mean, which you are.
Right.
Yeah, thematically that might be appropriate, but it's not that fun to play, just rolling the same number over and over again. On the flip side of that, roll to resolve does create drama and tension. And so if you've got one of those moments where you're on your last leg and your enemy's on their last leg and it all comes down to one die roll, those create some of the most memorable moments in gaming, period.
Right.
But it's a significant trade-off.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like the rolling to resolve. I don't think it might not bother me quite as much as it does you, but it's all the other dice you're rolling with it and all of the rules to modify that and all the calculations you have to make that really kind of start to bog it down for me. And I'm sure that's just very standard for a lot of these types of games. And the people who are into that, they're just not going to care because that's why they're playing.
And see, for me, this is when I have a bit of mixed feelings on. So this is what fleshes out the combat system a little bit more than just roll and see what happens. Because even combat is basically just a skill check, right? And the way that combat works in this game, I mean, skill checks generally roll a die. And you might get to roll some other dice with it, but that's essentially how they work. With combat, you have ranged and melee combat. We've talked a little bit about how melee works, where you just, as long as your bases of your two miniatures are touching, you can swing a hammer or whatever at them. For range combat, you have to you look at your weapons card that has its own little card that tells you what kind of damage it does and all that. It also tells you its range. And depending on the weapon, some weapons may only be able to be fired at short range, and it'll say, hey, you have this pistol, you can fire it at anything that's green ruler away from you. Or you might be able to do a short range and a long range option. So, you've got a sniper rifle, for instance. You can fire it at green range. It's not going to do great for you. Or you can fire it at long range and you'll get extra bonus dice with it. And for me, that's pretty interesting because there's a suboptimal way to roll to attack with a thing. And then there is an optimal way. And the optimal way adds extra dice to your roll that give you like the ability to decrease an opponent's armor, for instance, so that you hit them for more damage if you hit them, or to decrease the number on your to hit die so that you have a higher chance to hit, or any number of other crazy things, different effects that can go along with this. the upside of that is it feels more robust than just roll to see if you hit and do a base amount of damage. You can have some cool side effects that come along, and it makes it feel like you have more agency in the combat process.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. I think for me, it was just the looking at multiple cards and things like that and making sure I wasn't forgetting something and like putting into that dice pool that I was rolling and making sure that I was doing that correctly and like taking into considerations what kind of action I was taking or if they had cover and things like that. That's the stuff that kind of bogged me down. I do think that you have these weapon cards and that modifies it and they have an optimal range and things like that. I do think those are all like great additions.
Yeah, especially I like the idea that it's not just getting closer to a thing that's better for you. Sometimes trying to keep distance between you and somebody is what you want. And when these creatures are constantly trying to advance toward you or toward the objective, that adds some nice flavor. But yeah, the downside of it is exactly what you mentioned, like all the iconography on the dice and everywhere else in the game. I mean, it's just, there's a lot to keep in mind there and a lot to reference. But yeah, man, there are just abilities printed everywhere in this game. On perks, on weapons, on your character card, on all these different places. Plus, if you've got a crew, you've got multiple units out on the board. It is so much to keep track of. You're just going to miss things. In fact, when we were preparing for playing this game, there's a video that Modifius put up on their YouTube channel that shows you how the AI works. And so the guy plays a sample solo game, so you can kind of watch him. And at several points in the video, he forgets a rule or forgets an ability or forgets to add something to his die pool.
Or looks at the wrong stat.
And they have to put a little note down at the bottom that says, hey, sorry, we missed this. You know, what we should have done was this. That's pretty telling, right? I mean, if the publisher or designers of this game are putting up videos and they are constantly getting rules wrong.
Yeah.
That means that people like us are going to be at even less of an advantage remembering all this stuff.
Yeah.
And so in the end, it just ends up feeling, it's pretty fiddly, I would say.
Yes.
And that's, again, coming from a board gamer's perspective. It feels fiddly to me.
Right.
And maybe if you play miniatures games, it's not a big deal to you. But that was one thing I had a problem with, was keeping track of all the different abilities and all that stuff.
It was the same for me. I had a hard time like feeling confident that I was actually keeping up with everything and making sure I was doing things correctly.
Yeah. But the base concept of how the combat system works is quite interesting and color coded nicely to the different dice and range rulers and things like that. Like all that I felt like was pretty well considered. It's keeping track of everything going on at once. Actually, in some ways, it feels similar to Madara to me in that way.
In what ways?
Like Madara you've got this character with special abilities, and then you've got 10 pieces of equipment, and all of those have different things on them that affect how many dice are in your pool or different advantages or disadvantages you have. And my main issue with that was when you've got two characters, you've got 25 things you've got to remember.
Yeah, it was definitely present there, especially when you're controlling two characters. Personally, with Madara, I felt like it was a little bit more, I knew what to look at where and could kind of remember what all things to look at. It just seemed a little bit more streamlined than this. But yeah, I mean, still obviously a lot to take in.
Yeah. That is the core of this game, really, though, is moving and attacking. Those are the main things you're going to be doing here. The way that works out in any different scenario or what choices you'll make about when to attack and where, I mean, that varies greatly depending on the movements of the enemies, what the objective is for that current round. Because the nice thing about this game is there are lots of scenarios in here. You don't have to go in this expecting a kill all the bad guys kind of scenario. They're objective based, so in some cases you might need to keep enemies from destroying some object on the map, or you need to have kind of a king of the hill type situation where you need to hold a particular spot or protect a unit. I mean, there are a lot of different things that could be going on in these scenarios. So all of that feels pretty varied. And I feel like does a good job of making use of a game that's essentially just about moving and attacking. Every game does feel pretty different, I would say. Even if you're playing the same scenario over, there's enough variability here that it's changed.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, you've got this whole robust campaign system and settlement system that I didn't even really delve into at all.
No, I didn't either.
I mean, just the pace at which we review games, we don't have the luxury of spending that much time on any one that we're trying to review. But there's a fair amount in this starter set, I would say. There are more that you can download online. And then just the way that this game works is pretty much infinitely expandable.
Yeah.
You can drop as much money on this game as you want to by buying 3D terrain, buying more unit types. And when you buy one of those boxes, at least in the Wave 1 set of material that came out for this game, anytime you buy one of those boxes, you get another scenario in it, plus the cards that you need for those units. So if you're not satisfied with what's in here, there's a ton more out there.
Yeah, a whole lot more.
Yeah. And all of that would be interesting just if you were playing this multiplayer. Of course, you would want access to more units and more terrain and everything to make your table look nicer while you play. For the solo player, though, there's still a lot to chew on. And that brings us to the AI system for this, which is why this game is lauded for solo players. It's hard to explain exactly how this works, but basically, every unit in the game for the enemies has a card. And this card has a grid on it, a 3x3 grid here. And basically, when it's this unit's turn, you're going to roll a die, and the number of whatever kind of result you're looking for on here, Nuka-Cola bottles or stars or nuclear explosion symbols that show up on those dice, is going to determine what that unit does this round. So it's random in a sense because it all comes down to a die roll. But you see ahead of time what their set of moves are. And then when you find out, okay, so I've rolled my die for this unit, I need to look on this grid, find out which action they're going to do this turn. There's going to be, one of 4 major options. There's movement, attacking, objective, and fallback. And that's pretty interesting because I guess the way that I had imagined this working is you make your move and then the enemies advance toward you. Or something like that. They're just kind of brainlessly coming after you. But I mean, it makes sense that they wouldn't do it that way because that would just make the game clump up basically in the middle of the map and just be a big mass of miniatures throwing dice at one another. And that's not fun or interesting at all.
Just be like a tower defense game almost.
Yeah, basically. Instead, the way this works is some of these blocks in the middle of this grid that give you whatever the action is for this turn are gray and some are white. And that tells you whether the unit is going to behave recklessly this turn or whether it's going to proceed a little bit more methodically. And these are handled, I would say, pretty thematically. So animals that don't have much higher order thinking skill, they just rush at you and they don't consider how they get to you. They just try to make a beeline for you or for the objective, if that's what you rolled for this turn. Creatures that have more higher order thinking, they tend to try to make use of cover. So that's what it means to proceed methodically. If they're moving toward you, but they want to be behind cover if they can handle it, which is great because, naturally in these games, cover is a very big deal. It gives you bonuses to defense and keeps people from being able to get at you so easily. And what I like about this system is it just means that they end up making smarter decisions. Just being able to see what they might do gives you the opportunity to plan for it. But being unsure of exactly which choice they're going to pick, that is, for me, the basis of the best AI systems in board gaming.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool system that they have this grid and that it works out and these die do it. And the 2 things that you're using to look up on this grid are the die roll and then how much health it has. And it's just like that idea of like, oh, they're in a more panic state. And so this is what they're doing. That's a nice like thematic touch in my mind.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, or sometimes they'll activate according to how many friendly models they have around them. And so it functions a little bit more like playing against somebody else. Like you understand the basic tactics they're trying to use. They aren't brainless zombies. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. The downside to this is that it falls back on kind of a typical flowchart type model. So when you know that the unit is going to attack this turn, there's also a card in the box that tells you, okay, here's how attacks work. Can it do this thing? If yes, then just do that thing. If no, then proceed to step number 2. And it's not a long flowchart. It's not complicated really, but it does mean you're going to end up spending still a significant amount of time on your enemy's turns trying to figure out what they're going to do.
Right. And that's the thing, like this chart is a cool idea, but until you get the like kind of order of operations memorized with, just, I mean, how does like a melee attack work, for an enemy? Of just like, okay, can it move and attack? Or can it attack this? Okay, well, can it move? Can it charge and then attack? Can it move and then charge? Like it's a lot of little things that you have to kind of go through and figure out, I feel like. And just like memorizing that or looking it up.
Yeah, I think so too. It's a really interesting system because it does make this playable as a solo game. And not even just playable, it's a good system.
Yes.
Really interesting. It's still not the kind that I enjoy the most because it still means I end up spending a lot of time on the enemy's turns trying to figure out what they need to do, trying to consider their special abilities and whatnot. And that's just not really how I want to play a solo game.
Yeah, it's just not as fun. I mean, I definitely spent more time on the AI's turn.
Yeah, for sure. But then again, if you're playing a multiplayer game, a miniatures game, you do spend a lot of time waiting on your opponent to decide what they're going to do with their turn. And so, I mean, in terms of time spent on your turn versus not, it's probably not all that different, I would say. It's just that you're bearing all the load for it.
Yeah.
And for me, that's not a draw, but I would say if you like tabletop miniatures games and you're not able to play them as often as you want to be able to play them, this is really cool because this allows you to do that in a way that it's not really been done. I won't say it's never been done before, but I'll say it's not done often.
Yeah.
Because there are other solo rule sets out there, like the Rangers of Shadow Deep, for instance, is pretty popular based on the Frostgrave system. That's a solo tabletop system. That's cool. And that's something I want to look into one day and just haven't taken time to do it. But it's neat that you can do this and it's not just brainless. It is a good, interesting system.
So for you personally, how does this AI system compare to the system in Madara? Obviously, this is more in depth, but just, I guess, general like cognitive load of handling it. Is it satisfying enough? Does this depth really make a difference for you?
That's a good question. I think Madara is a little bit easier for me in some ways just because it's a hex-based or grid-based system, I guess. Mm-hmm. So everything happens in sort of the typical board game format that I'm used to. And this is just enough outside of my usual arena, I guess, that it feels a little bit harder for me just to keep it in my head. But in reality, I don't think rules-wise there's that much difference between the two of them. Because for Madara, you're still activating units and then reading through basically a little flowchart on each unit's card. And you end up activating more steps on it than you do on these. And so I guess I would say it's similar weight. For me, this is just foreign enough that it feels maybe a little bit heavier.
I think to me, though, Madara felt simpler because it was just, I just looked at the one card and I just went through really quickly how it activates. And, I don't know. I think it seemed easier to run than to me personally, as far as a cognitive load.
I guess that's probably true. It does have more things spelled out on the card than these do too. This is very icon heavy. I mean, on the different unit cards, there's almost no text at all. It's just, here's a letter and it may be shaded or not. I mean, over time, I think you will become very well acquainted with that and it'll be almost like second nature. But I guess the same thing is true of Madara, right? There's a lot to consider and to keep in your head there. And we had flip back and forth for different kinds of rules there. Yeah, I guess Madara feels slightly simpler to me, but I don't think they're that much different rules-wise from my perspective.
Okay.
And for you, it feels like Madara is easier to manage.
Yeah, it was just running the AI. There's other things that Madara is like more rules, like looking up and all this types of stuff. But I feel like the AI everything I needed was on the card most of the time.
Yeah.
As far as like running the AI and helping it make choices.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. There's a lot of similarities between that and this. Yeah. Actually, I would say. The campaign system obviously is much more fleshed out in Madara. Although it's pretty robust here too. It's like a more freewheeling kind of system here, whereas that's very much like a choose your own adventure kind of path.
Absolutely.
I think all this comes together in a way that is very interesting and unlike anything else I have played overall. I mean, it has similarities to Madara and whatnot, but I've never played a game quite like this. And so now I think that's a good place for us to move into the end of this review where we wrap up by talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly for this game. And, as with all of our reviews, obviously you should take what we say with a grain of salt. These are just our opinions on the game, right? But even more so with this review, because this is obviously not a game that was meant for us. But part of what we do when we try to review games is we try to not only just review what we think is good and games that we love, but games that you all would like to hear about, or maybe that would be interesting to you if you want to try something new. There is a much wider world of solo gaming out there than what we typically cover on this show. There are plenty of solo war games, and there's a whole community around that. Game books like Fighting Fantasy and that sort of thing. And then now there are an increasing number of these solo tabletop miniatures games. So this is, again, not really our typical wheelhouse. But even so, I'm just going to move into what I think is good about this game. For me, overall, I would say that the best thing about this game is the AI system. Yeah. I'm really impressed with what they managed to accomplish.
Yeah, I think it's a really good system. Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you are a solo player and you want to try a game that, movement and attacking are the core of it, that typical tabletop game, this is a really interesting place to start. I also think the miniatures are really solid. They're not amazing. They're not going to knock your socks off, but they're a solid set of miniatures for this game. And component-wise, overall, I would say is good.
Yeah, all the components are solid.
And also just the fact that the gameplay and the different scenarios are varied and yet also can be strung together into a campaign. And there's this whole robust settlement system. All of that for me also belongs firmly in this category.
And is good also in capturing the Fallout world, which so many people love.
Yeah, it definitely, you get a lot of the quirkiness and everything from that world, and is an interesting place to try to capture in a non-video format. I feel like they've done a pretty good job of that here.
Right. You don't have the exploration that you have in Fallout, but, building a settlement, fighting super mutants, things like that.
Yeah. The other good news here is that if you like this, and this is your thing, man, you can go way down the rabbit hole with this if you really want to.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to buy for it.
Yeah. I mean, it will cost you some serious cash because miniatures games aren't cheap. But if you know that going in and you really like it, this is something that you can invest time in, and it can become almost a lifestyle game for you. So if you want something that you can get lost in over time, I think after you overcome the rules burden, this can be that game for you. And for me, those are the best things about this game. There are some things that I would consider to be bad. And I'm going to expand that to say not just bad for me, but I think a lot of people coming from a board gamer's perspective will have a harder time with. And one of them is the cost for the game. It seems high compared to a typical board game purchase.
Yes.
For the amount of money that you spend on this core set, you can get some really nice, well fleshed out board games that have really high quality miniatures in them. And so it's going to seem like a lot to ask. There's just a different price scale for these kind of games. And that takes some getting used to. It's not ugly necessarily, because if you're part of that world, it makes perfect sense to you, but it feels bad for somebody who's not typically part of it, I would say. Also, it's a pretty high time investment just to learn the rules and to get over that initial hump.
Yeah, there's a lot to take in the very beginning.
Yeah, a lot of icons, a lot of different little fiddly things to keep track of. And for me, that's where this goes for the most part. The rules aspect of this. The rules aren't bad. The mental load that I devote to keeping the rules in my head is bad.
Yes, I would completely agree with that.
And I guess all of that could just be summed up by saying it's not really a game for me. And so there's an element of that fiddliness and things like that I'm not just used to in most of my games that feel bad to me, and put this game in that category. But if you like this kind of games and you're used to that, then that may not be an issue for you at all.
Yeah, I could see it very easily wouldn't bother a lot of people, but like you, this game isn't really ever going to be for me.
Yeah. But if you like to sink yourself into rules and to find workarounds for all of the cans and cans of this game, then this is probably your type of game, I would say. The only thing that I would put in the ugly category are the tokens and the paper mat. I hate them.
Yeah.
They're one of the most frustrating components I've experienced in a game in a while. And, in the grand scheme of things, it is nitpicky for sure. And I'll be the first one to admit that. But fiddliness is something that really bothers me. It's just made worse when all the components that you're dealing with are tiny.
Yeah, they are very tiny. I think the size of the tokens bothers me a little bit more than the paper mat.
Yeah, definitely more than the paper mat. But the paper mat I also really dislike. The first thing I would do if I was playing this game is buy the neoprene mat.
Mm-hmm.
I just could not handle playing on the paper.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a personal thing, but that's one thing that I would put in this category. And so as you could probably tell, this is not a game that's going to get the Solosaurus stamp of approval. It's just not really our kind of game. But that does not mean it's a bad game. And we wanted to branch out and try something a little bit different for your sake. If it seems like it would be up your alley, I think it's a good representation of the kind of game it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a good implementation for solo players and a cool implementation of this universe. And so even though it's not for us, it is a game I would say look into it a little bit more if you're intrigued by it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not going to be a bad purchase unless it's a bad fit for the kind of gamer you are. And that's all that we've got for this episode. One thing I want to start with here in the announcements is, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, we are giving this copy of the game away. And so if you are interested in the miniatures game world and you want to try out a Fallout game and you don't really like painting, this is a great opportunity for you because this is not a cheap game, and the paint job from the guys at Miniatures Mutated is very good quality, and I would love for you to check it out. So if you're interested in painting commissions, you can go and check out Miniatures Mutated on Facebook and check out the kind of work that they do, what their pricing guide is. The guys are very nice, very easy to work with, and friendly. Definitely give them a look. And if you want to win a copy of this game, go to our Facebook page or our Instagram. We've got a link there to the giveaway, and go and enter that. We'll be giving that away in just a couple of weeks. Also, if you haven't yet followed us on Facebook or Instagram, you should do that so that you can see my subpar quality pictures of games in bad lighting that we've been playing recently.
What have you taken pictures of recently?
I tried to take a picture of Renegade last night, and it's all shadowy and weird because there's a big overhead light in this office, and when there's not light coming in the windows, I can't do it.
Yeah.
Also, board games are hard to take pictures of, man.
Yeah, they're not really a photogenic subject.
No, they're not. So cut me a break, y'all. Cut me some slack and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You're going to love it. I've just sold it to you, and now you know you're going to love it. Also, if you haven't yet given us a review or rated us on iTunes, please do that. That really helps other people to see the show and learn more about solo games, and we'd love to do that for other people. And finally, if you have not yet gotten our micro badge on Board Game Geek, you can send me a message and I will get you the Geek Gold that you need to get one for yourself. Every episode I mention this, every episode we get 2 to 3 people who ask for a micro badge. So come on, folks, let's keep getting them, and we will keep flooding Board Game Geek with a logo that actually looks good.
Yes.
And until next time then, I'm Brandon Waite.
And I'm Carter Mackey.
And this is Solosaurus.